First off, I'm going to introduce you to Julie. Julie is a master's student at the University of Illinois, and she is going to tell us today about the research that she did, funded by the Kendeigh grants that we give out every year. And with that, Julie, I'm going to hand it over to you. You're welcome to take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Alita. Let me just share my slides here, and we'll get this show on the road. How's that look?
Yeah, that looks great.
Great. All right. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Julie. I'm a second-year master's student at the University of Illinois. My advisor is Dr. Mike Ward, and I am studying Eastern Meadowlarks and the factors that are contributing to their decline. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you all today. A brief outline before we get into the bones of the presentation. We'll cover a little bit of the history about grassland bird decline, and then we'll move on to the first half of my project, which the Kendeigh grant helped with, which is Eastern Meadowlark wintering grounds, the methods and the goals behind that research. And then we'll go on to the second part of my project, which is meadowlark and land cover change over time. And we'll look at different land cover analyses, where that data came from and what we're hoping to gain from using that data. And then we'll go over some conclusions and future directions. So to start off, as I'm sure we all kind of gathered at this point, grassland birds are the most rapidly declining suite of birds in North America. And the long suspected cause of this decline is loss of habitat. Now, the thing that a lot of people may not realize historically is that when the transition from prairie to agriculture first began, it looked a lot like this middle picture on the right where the cattle are. It was really focused on providing food for cattle in the form of cereal grains or longer, taller grains. And so although these are not native plant species, functionally the habitat still provided nesting materials and something similar to a prairie. And so they became known as pseudo prairies. After the 1950s is when there was kind of a shift to row crop agriculture. And that's what the third picture represents. And that's when we really start to see these massive declines in avian grassland species to 85, 90% declines in abundance. So we're going to shift here to talk about meadowlark declines specifically, but first I want to introduce a paper that some of you may have heard of. It was written by Rosenberg et al. And it was published in 2019. And it was an analysis of the decline of avifauna in North America. And they analyzed 529 species. And what they found was that over the course of 50 years, North America lost 3 billion birds, which is shocking. The more shocking part is that those 3 billion birds were represented mostly by 24 species. In fact, 75% of the birds lost were only represented by 20 species as a whole. So the vast majority of North American birds are doing just fine, but this small group of them are the cause for the loss. Unfortunately for meadowlarks, they are number 14 on that list, and they account for 2.5% of the 3 billion birds lost. Since 1970, we have lost nearly 74 million meadowlarks. And based off the numbers we have today, that's 1 in every 4 meadowlarks that are still remaining. So we've lost about 75% of the population since 1970, which is, again, kind of shocking because you can hear them and see them everywhere you go. They are still one of the most common birds in North America, but not nearly to the extent that they used to be, which is why we're so concerned. We really want to try to keep the common birds common. So in Illinois specifically, they're experiencing declines of minus 3.4% just in Illinois each year, and 2.5% declines across the United States as a whole. And that's according to breeding bird survey data. And they've actually since been listed as an Illinois species in greatest need of conservation. So they really need a little bit of help from us. The important thing to remember is that when you want to conserve a migratory species like Eastern Meadowlarks, you need to consider the entire annual cycle. You need to look at their breeding grounds, their migration and stopover sites, where they spend the winter. And the tricky part is that there can be variation in that migration. Some birds that winter in the north, like Wisconsin, may only travel as far south as southern Illinois, whereas birds that breed in Illinois may go as far as Texas. There are some birds that don't migrate at all and they just stay in the same place year round. So that's kind of the question we had with our Illinois breeding Eastern Meadowlarks, was where are they going? Which brings me to the first part of my project. Unfortunately, this part is still underway, and so I don't have results from the data from what the grant helped me with at the moment. But I will get those, and I would be happy to come back and give you those results. So we wanted to know where these birds wintered. And so last year we captured 19 female Eastern Meadowlarks, and we deployed GPS archival tags on them. So those tags store data, and in order to retrieve the data, we need to recapture them. And we had basically this map on the right is what eBird is estimating as their wintering range. In this darker purple, it's showing the higher densities of birds. So we are trying to see if we can corroborate that estimation with the details we get back from the tags. We had 4 field site locations represented by the yellow pins, all in East Central Illinois. We had Kenneigh County Park, Sibley and Saybrook pheasant habitat areas, and Monticello Field Station, which is right down in Champaign County. When we caught the birds and we put tags on them, a lot of them looked just like this, with an antenna sticking right off the back. It's a very small tag. It's not cumbersome or inhibitive to the bird's flight at all. It's a very negligible weight. It's only a couple of grams. So the way that we caught these birds, we actually struggled quite a bit to capture them. We wanted to catch males at first, actually, and they outsmarted us quite a bit. So we moved on to catching females because we figured what would be easier to catch than a nice dedicated mother. So we would go nest searching by dragging a long rope in the field, and the females would hear that rope coming in the grasses. They would think it's a predator, and they would flush off their nest, which you can see is a really beautiful nest and kind of hard to see if you're not looking for it. Once we found the nest, we moved on to the picture on the right, and we would put a mist net around the nest with the opening to the nest facing the net. So when the female returned to incubation, we could just approach the nest and she would flush right into our net, and we would process her and take measurements and give her a transmitter. So we will be recapturing these tagged birds very soon. I actually just started gathering up some volunteers for the season, and we'll be going out and trying to get those tags back, and then I can make pretty maps and things like that to see where they went. So we'll move on to the second part of the project, which I have a bit more data on at the moment, and that's looking at how Illinois land cover has changed over time in comparison with meadowlark abundance. And to do this, we actually partnered up with Dr. Caillou Guan and his associates through the University of Illinois. And he was able to obtain satellite imagery of Illinois for every year from 1999 to 2020, along breeding bird survey routes down to each stop level. So each breeding bird survey route is composed of 50 stops. So we obtained land cover around each of those stopping points. And our overall goal was to determine if any changes in the land cover over that 20-21 year period correspond to these abundance changes that we see in meadowlarks. So this was a little bit of a tedious process in the beginning because the breeding bird survey does not actually release the exact locations for the stop data. Thankfully, my advisor, Dr. Mike Ward, had the hard copy breeding bird survey maps. So with a little bit of time, I was able to go on Google Earth and physically plot out each of these points that you can see on this map. Each route, like I said, has 50 points. They're about half a mile apart. So the whole route is about 24.5 miles long. And I did this for every route in Illinois. And then we handed those coordinates over to Dr. Guan, and he put a 400-meter buffer around each BBS stop. Now, because these points are half a mile apart, using a buffer of 400 meters prevents any overlap in the land cover data. So he was able to then quantify the percent cover of different types of landscapes around each of these stops during that time frame. The satellite imagery was like really detailed, and as time went on, it just got like more and more detailed, down to like specific vegetables at some point, which was very impressive, but also a little daunting to look at. So to simplify the process, we consolidated these categories into 9 simpler categories for major crops that are in Illinois, and grasslands and forest and shrubland. And then we had another category to put all those vegetables in. But this is much more consolidated than it was. So what we have here is land cover averages in the year 1999, which is represented in orange, and 2020 in blue. Now, these averages are groups of 10 BBS stops for each route. We took the average of each of 10 stops to account for variation in where I plotted points and where an observer was actually stopping. Because I don't have specific points from the observers, there's always a chance that they could have stopped, you know, another quarter mile up the road or something like that. So to account for that variation, we grouped it into chunks of 10. But the notable things in this graph you can see is that corn increased, as did developed areas and forested areas. And the most substantial increase, which doesn't really even need a drum roll at this point, is grassland. It's a very substantial drop in the last 20 years, the amount of grassland that's in Illinois. So that is our exclamation point right there. These are some individual graphs of averages. And as you can see, as I said earlier, imagery gets better over time. And with cover types like grassland and developed areas, there's a little bit more variation in the first few years of the data before they level out a little bit. Like, for example, if you look at the grassland on the top right, from 2006 to 2007, there was a massive spike in development. That could just be an advancement in the imagery that it wasn't picking up before then. But grassland as a whole has declined quite a bit, and other things have increased that may not be as beneficial for grassland species. This is Eastern Meadowlark abundance specifically over time in that same time frame from 1999 to 2020. And of course, you know, this is dependent on detection probability and observer bias. However, we can all probably pick out of the field what a meadowlark sounds like. So detection probability for them is generally better than it is for other species, which is good, but also unfortunate that they're declining at such a staggering rate. And we were very interested to know why that is. So we decided to use the land cover data and couple it with the breeding bird survey data and see if there was anything that lined up. And what we found when we ran our models is that grassland played the biggest role in the variability that we see in meadowlarks. And that tells us that the way that the land cover changed as it pertains to grassland fit the data that we have for meadowlarks the best. Whereas shrubland on the bottom didn't really seem to impact meadowlarks at all. Grassland did the most, which is not entirely surprising to us. What we have here are some graphs of our raw data. So this is not fancied up at all. It's just the raw data, the percent of a certain land cover on the x-axis as it pertains to the number of meadowlarks on the y-axis. And you can see some clear relationships here with forest and developed areas. As the amount of forest increases, the number of meadowlarks decrease. With corn, there's not as much of an obvious relationship. We're kind of attributing to that to the fact that there is just so much corn that little variation here and there isn't really being picked up by the models. But you can see increases in development show the same relationship that forest did. we wanted to dig into grassland a little bit more because it's so important to the species. And looking at the raw data, we found that in areas with absolutely no grass whatsoever, there were no meadowlarks. But in areas that had at least 60% of grass, that number of meadowlarks spiked to 7.4 on average. Excuse me. And if you look at this graph below here, again, similar to corn, there's not much of an obvious relationship with the grass. It's not as clear as it was with the development of the forested areas. We're attributing that to the fact that this grass category is all encompassing of any grass. Whereas I can tell you from experience in the field, meadowlarks don't like any type of grass. They definitely show preferences towards areas that have more litter on the ground, you know, or areas that are not too tall. So even though there are some areas with grass left in Illinois, it's not all necessarily suitable for meadowlarks. So it's not a guarantee that they'll use it. Some conclusions that we can draw from this data, grasslands have decreased on average by 70 hectares for every 10 breeding bird survey stops. And that's a pretty substantial amount of grass to have declined in that 20-year time. Eastern meadowlarks as a whole have decreased by 26%. And the loss of grasslands can be potentially due to increased corn, forested areas, and development in that 20-year time period. We've seen an increase in corn on average by 17.5 hectares, and then forest increased by 31.7 and development by 44 hectares per 10 stops. And again, this is all in Illinois, and this is all from 1999 to 2020. For future directions in this research, we are hoping that we can assess the possible causes of meadowlark decline outside the breeding season. So with any luck, some of these birds that I tagged will return to their breeding grounds, and I will retrieve that data. And if we find out that a bird traveled to Texas, we may be able to do the same land cover analysis in Texas and see what the wintering grounds look like. If those habitats are not in good shape or not providing the resources that meadowlarks need, then that shows that they need conservation on both their breeding and their wintering grounds, and this is not a singular issue for the population. We also hope to potentially expand this project to look at other declining grassland species, such as bobolinks or grasshopper sparrows. There's also an interesting relationship that dickcissels have with meadowlarks. Seemingly, dickcissels are increasing quite a bit, and we often find them in the same areas that meadowlarks are in, and that's kind of a question to us. Why are meadowlarks declining if they're in the same areas that dickcissels are? So we may look into those populations as well to see if there's any unique relationships that exist there. And finally, I would like to acknowledge some funding sources and the permissions I've gotten for field sites, especially to you all of the Champaign County Audubon Society. I really appreciate you awarding me that grant and allowing me to be able to do this very interesting and rewarding research. And Illinois Department of Natural Resources, the Ornithological Society, as well as the University of Illinois and the Vermilion County Conservation District. So if you all have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. And again, I will be happy to come back when I have data about their migration and share that with you too.
Awesome,
Julie,
thank you.
I have two questions. One was I was surprised by the increase in forests. What's happening there?
Well, you know, like I said, there's a lot of variability in the early years of the data. So that dramatic increase may not be as dramatic as it shows, but a lot of areas are becoming reforested, and there's a good bit of cedar encroachment that happens in native grasslands that are still around. So it could be attributed to any of those things at this moment, especially, you know, historically wildfires used to prevent forests from developing in prairie grounds, which is why a lot of nature organizations like IDNR will do prescribed burns, but a lot of areas still develop successional species like trees. So it could be pertaining to that.
The other question, how do tallgrass prairie restorations, are they helpful for meadowlarks or not?
Do you mean like the CRP program, like that type of stuff?
Well, no, I'm thinking I'm an Urbana Park District Commissioner, and we have Meadowbrook. We have 80 acres of tallgrass prairie at Meadowbrook, and then we have prairie in other areas. And I know that the Champaign County Forest Preserve District has been working on tallgrass prairies. Is that helpful, or do they need more shortgrass type of environments?
From what I know, and I only have one season under my belt, so I'll probably learn more this season. The nests that I found were in shorter environments, but that was when shorter environments were available in the area. I think that given the choice from what I've seen, they'll choose to nest in the smaller environments, but that doesn't mean that they don't utilize the tall grass prairies for other resources. Because I've definitely seen males in taller grasses singing and foraging and doing all of these other behaviors. So I think as long as there's like litter on the ground for them to nest with and resources for food and a decent territory size away from a tree line, I don't think that they will mind a tall grass prairie from what I've seen, at least. It's really just about resource availability. And if they're given the choice and they can have both in the same area, I think they'd be happy with that. but it really comes down to what's in the area.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
What was there a change in the Conservation Reserve Program, the CREP program over the last 21 years?
I believe there has been. We didn't get very deep into that data yet. That's probably going to come down the line. But from the readings that I've done regarding the CRP program, it doesn't necessarily increase grassland species because it's not always the types of grass that specific things like meadowlarks would find useful. So it does help a lot of species, but it doesn't benefit them all equally, is basically the gist of what I've found so far.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you that I'm part of the Breeding Bird Survey, and I'm glad to see you using the data.
Oh yeah, we use it all the time. I'm digging through that stuff with a fine-tooth comb.
Right?
There are also two questions in the chat. Megan and I have similar questions. Megan says, thanks for a great presentation. Do female EAMEs have high fidelity to previous nest sites? I'm curious what your strategy for finding the tagged birds will look like. And then I had a follow-up question. Has there been studies on recapture rates? Just out of interest, I'm wondering how successful this recapture is.
So I wasn't a student at the time, but 2 years ago, our lab was putting an effort into trying to catch male meadowlarks, and it only yielded one, but that one banded bird did return to the same site last year. So we were able to actually see it singing from a telephone wire, and it had its leg band on there. So we know that the males will at least come back. I've seen some conflicting research regarding site fidelity. Some say that males come back more often than females. Others say that it's a more similar return rate. But I haven't heard any flat out like, no, they don't come back. So I'm really keeping my fingers crossed. In terms of a strategy, we put out 19 tags, and half of those tags have a beacon, kind of like a radio telemetry beacon. And so those will turn on April 20th, and I will be walking through my fields with an antenna to see if I can pick up any frequencies. Aside from that, because we only tagged females, we are anticipating that if they do come back, they will try to nest. So we'll be rope dragging again this year and really just put a capture effort into any female that we flush. And if we catch one and it has bands on it, then I will do a very big happy dance. So we're hoping that recapture rates will be pretty decent. Other people in other parts of the country are doing very well capturing meadowlarks, but I don't know how many of them use archival tags and need to recollect them. The tags that actually ping GPS points to you are bigger and more expensive. So we did what we could.
I wish I could be there for the excitement of finding the first egg.
Yeah.
I just imagine the joyous screams resonating.
Well, if you'd ever like to come on out in the field, send me an email.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Okay, so I'm gonna move on. Oh wait, there was one more question. What do meadowlarks prefer as far as grasses?
So I can really only speak to their nesting habitat, and from what I've read so far, and what I've found is they really like litter on the ground, like loose grassy litter to make their nests out of. The fields that I have found nests in haven't been very tall. They've only been like a foot to a foot and a half high. Commonly in cool season grasses like smooth brome or something like that. Fields that get hayed or mowed are good too. We didn't find any nests last year in fields that had been recently burned because the litter from the burn had gotten burned up. So it wasn't there anymore. But definitely litter is a prerequisite from what I've found for them to have a nest. And they'll sing from anywhere. I've seen them sing from trees and neighboring fields that have nothing in them. So that could just mean that they have an expansive territory. But for their nests, I've seen shorter grasses with litter.
For what it's worth, the meadowlarks are back at Kennecook. Maybe you know that.
Yeah, thank you. I was just out there last week trying to see if any females had come back, but so far it still looks like it's mostly males that are chasing each other around. So I don't think they've started nesting just yet, but it's on the horizon for sure.
Okay, so this is the first time I'm trying this. Are you all seeing this video screen?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So I'm gonna play it for you. Hopefully the sounds okay. And if somebody can tell me if it doesn't sound okay, please.
Right. Hello, my name is Stephanie Schmidt. I was a 2021 Kendeigh grant recipient, and I want to talk about some of my research I was able to do thanks to the funding from the Champaign County Audubon Society. So I'll be talking about a little bit of my thesis research, which has looked at post-fledging survival and habitat use of the least bittern in Illinois. So first, I want to start out with why least bitterns. Well, least bitterns, like all marsh birds, are a group of wetland-dependent water birds that are typified by their habitat associations, their cryptic plumage, their sneaking behaviors, and their infrequent vocalizations. Unfortunately, these qualities have made least bitterns greatly understudied and undersurveyed, especially in classic roadside surveying efforts, which typically don't venture to wetlands or seek out some of these more cryptic species. And this is a problem because according to a 2019 study in the journal Science by Rosenberg et al., we are seeing that marsh birds are experiencing widespread population level declines. And in Illinois, least bitterns, again a type of marsh bird, are listed as state threatened. And one of the causes of these declines is habitat loss. So unfortunately, wetland loss and degradation is something that we are all too familiar with here in the United States. So this series of maps here depict the 53% of wetland acreage that was lost in the United States between the 1780s and the 1980s. We can see here that the Midwest has experienced substantial wetland loss during this time, and the majority of these losses were driven by land conversion for agriculture, with Illinois being one of the hardest hit states. So by the mid-1980s, Illinois had lost around 90% of its historic wetland acreage, and the majority of these losses occurred in the northern two-thirds of the state for both agricultural expansion and urbanization, especially around the Chicagoland region. So today, the vast majority of remaining wetlands on the landscape are small and isolated and less than 100 acres in size. So this has prompted the need for wetland management and restoration. And one of the management actions that is taken is controlled dewatering, the removal of water in the spring and summer months to introduce disturbance and reset wetland stages. And this management is used across the nation in floodplain wetlands, landlocked impoundments, prairie pothole wetlands, and coastal wetlands. And it can be used alongside various other management practices, such as disking, mowing, herbiciding, or birding. It's also been found to be incredibly beneficial for a wide range of wetland plants and animals. So when water is pulled off of the landscape, this introduces mudflat, that's wonderful foraging habitat for shorebirds, and also helps to facilitate movement for mammals that are typically deterred by deeper water. So when that water is removed, mammals can access the marsh interior and resources that would have been inaccessible to them before. One of the largest benefits of this water removal is that it allows for the germination of moist soil plants, which eventually will produce high energy seeds that feed fall migrating waterfowl. The seasonal removal of water is also helpful for controlling the movement of invasive fish and amphibians and for recharging groundwater. And in the year following a drawdown, we're going to see greater creation of this emergent marsh habitat that's really attractive to marsh birds such as these bitterns. A dewatered landscape, however, does come with risk, and that risk is most often the risk of predation due to these changing habitat conditions. And predation accounts for around 70% of reproductive losses for all bird species, so it's really important for us to consider here with these vulnerable marsh bird species like our least bitterns, because these reproductive losses can have long-term population level effects. So in my thesis research, we have also found that these drawdowns during peak marsh bird nesting dates were implicated with greater predator access to marsh bird nests and greater mortality rates for these nests. So more specifically, earlier drawdowns that are removing greater quantities of water are positively linked with predation risk by mammals, who are again believed to be deterred by deeper water. And this study was highly beneficial for understanding management's impact on the marsh bird nesting stage or nesting success. And unfortunately, most studies that seek to answer this sort of question usually stop after assessing the impact on the nesting or the breeding stages. And these stages are most studied because they are often the easiest to study. These are when birds are going to be vocal and visible. When they're nesting, they're going to be sedentary or in one location. However, the post-fledging stage, or the period of time after a young bird leaves the nest before it reaches independence, is an incredibly critical yet understudied stage. This period of time is often when young birds are going to face the greatest risk of mortality, and young birds can be in this stage longer than they are in the breeding or the nesting stages. And one reason that this stage is so understudied is because fledglings are incredibly cryptic and non-territorial, but the use of radio telemetry using tiny tags that emit a radio frequency has allowed for more research during this stage. So before the use of radio, or the widespread use of radio telemetry, was often assumed that fledglings are using the same habitat as their adult counterparts. However, since this field of study has expanded to studies of fledglings in forests, grasslands, and wetlands, they found that fledgling habitat use may differ from adults or even within the post-fledgling stage as these birds gain flight ability or even independence. And this has been demonstrated with grasshopper sparrows, cerulean warblers, dick thistles, and American black ducks, just to name a few. And from a management perspective, this is important because it means that you may need to manage for a more diverse landscape while fledglings are present to provide adequate habitat for all birds. These and a myriad of other studies have also found that post-fledgling survival is incredibly important for management. So as noted before, the post-fledgling stage often faces the greatest risk of mortality, and more often this mortality occurs as a bottleneck in the first 3 days to 2 weeks post-fledgling, with survival rates ranging from around 23 to 87%. And this is important because for the long-term persistence of populations, especially these already vulnerable marsh bird populations or these least bittern populations, fledgling survival as well as egg and nesting survival is going to influence how many birds reach sexual maturity and can reproduce and contribute to a population's growth or stability. Fledgling survival has also been found to be impacted by habitat factors, and for that reason, studies are really starting to suggest that all life stages should really be used to inform management. So finally, this brings me to my research goal. And the goal of my research is to use least bittern post-fledgling survival and habitat use to better inform wetland management practices for marsh birds. So my research was conducted at Emequon Preserve in 2020 and 2021. And Emequon Preserve is pictured here in central Illinois along the Illinois River. Today it consists of Thompson Lake and Flag Lake, and it's managed by the Nature Conservancy. Historically, Emequon Preserve was tiled, ditched, and drained and used for agriculture for around 80 years, but for the past 20 years has been a site for active wetland restoration. And the Emequon Preserve, again managed by the Nature Conservancy, uses this active wetland restoration by pulling water down off of the site in the spring and summer months through a pump. So this research done in 2020 and 2021 was able to be done during two very different water management years. So in 2020, Emequon Preserve implemented what we would categorize as a high intensity early season drawdown, pulling 4.5 feet of water off of landscape between June and August. That's pictured here in orange. And in 2021, they implemented a more late season low intensity drawdown, pulling only 1.5 feet of water off of landscape between July and August, pictured here in blue. And this is important because for the first part of my study, we had found that there was greater predation risk in 2020, the year of that early season high intensity drawdown, as opposed to 2021. So just keep this in the back of your mind as we move forward and talk about the second part of my study, which is that post-fledgling survival and habitat use factor. So in this study, we only studied post-fledging least bitterns. And as said before, least bitterns are wetland dependent, they're cryptic, and they're listed as threatened in the state of Illinois. So in the first study, we focused on survival for the 2 stages on the left, which are the incubation stage and the nestling stage. But here we're focusing on the post-fledging stage, which is 3 in from the left, the bird with the color bands, far right, of course, being the adult stage. So the post-fledging period is again defined as the time after a young bird leaves the nest and before it reaches independence. And in least bitterns, it was found to occur around 15 days post-hatch. And this study is asking the question of how post-fledging least bitterns are using their habitat and how these decisions may be impacting their mortality. Said before, post-fledging least bittern habitat use may differ from adults or even within this stage, and this stage often sees the greatest risk of mortality in other species. Oops. So my first objective in this study was to investigate habitat use in all fledglings, as well as age-specific habitat use in post-fledgling least bitterns. And my second objective was to determine how these habitat decisions, which are defined as spatial and temporal factors or habitat and activity factors, may be influencing least bittern post-fledging mortality. So this study was also conducted over 2 years, 2020 and 2021, and the majority of the work done in 2020 was used to answer some of those basic development and behavioral questions that were critical to advancing the project in 2021. So first, for this study, we needed fledglings. We needed fledglings that we knew the age of already. And the easiest way to do this was to continue to monitor our nests from the first part of our study until these birds reached fledgling age. And while we were monitoring them, we were most concerned with the growth and development of these chicks. We were interested in their weight, their mobility, and their feather development. So this project used glued on VHF tags. That was our radio telemetry aspect of our project. And to use them, we needed to ensure that tag weight was within 3 to 5% of a chick's body weight. And if the feathers are developed enough that we're not going to see that early rapid feather growth that's going to push the tag off of their skin or off of their feathers immediately following tagging efforts. And through this early work, we found that 15 days post-hatch was the best time for us to hand capture our fledglings and to attach tags. At this time, our fledglings were pretty reliably around 70 grams. They were mobile but not yet flighted, and they still remained relatively close to their nest site. When chicks were captured, we then attached color bands to their legs. We glued a VHF radio tag between their scapulars using super glue and a series of fabrics, and we were ready to start tracking our birds. We tracked our fledglings every 1 to 4 days in 2020 and 2021. By homing to their signals, when birds were found, we were then able to confirm their identity from their color bands that were present. And this, of course, led to a very fun game of can you spot the camouflaged small bird that should be directly in front of you based on your receiver's signal intensity. And of course, some birds were much easier to spot than others, but it really just amazed myself and my team just how well these birds can hide when a large predator, again, such as myself and my team, are just a foot or two away from them. So in 2020, we tracked some of our birds every single day, and we were able to use these daily movement locations to not only document fate, but also daily dispersal or daily movement. And we used this daily dispersal data to inform our habitat use versus availability study, which was only conducted in 2021. And it restricted randomly selected unoccupied habitat to habitat within their realistic range of movement, which was here defined in chunks of 15 to 20 days post-hatch, 21 to 28 days post-hatch, and 29 plus days post-hatch. So to address objective 1, investigate habitat use versus availability, I looked at used and randomly selected unused habitat for all fledglings, pre-flight fledglings, and post-flight fledglings. And our study revealed that on average, flight was attained at 31 days post-hatch. So this was ultimately used to be our cutoff for pre-flight birds versus post-flight birds. And for our habitat variables, we looked at habitat openness, which was defined as open marsh, hemi-marsh, dense marsh. We also looked at average emergent vegetation height, water depth, and dominant vegetation type, which included persistent emergent vegetation, cattail or bulrush, pictured here with our pre-flight birds, floating leaf vegetation, which is just lotus, pictured here with our post-flight birds, and then a category called other. Next, to address objective 2 and determine causes of mortality in 2020 and 2021, I looked at fledgling fate in relation to these habitat and activity variables, which included water depth, habitat openness, distance from the nest, dominant vegetation type, year, day of year, and age. So first, I looked at habitat use versus availability for all fledglings, and here I saw that fledglings were consistently selecting for taller vegetation and for denser habitats over open marsh habitat, with no clear preference for dense marsh habitat over hemi-marsh habitat. We also found that our birds were selecting for that persistent emergent vegetation or that cattail or their bulrush. And all of these habitat structures that they're selecting for are going to provide protection from predators while foraging and refuge from adverse weather conditions, in contrast to some of these more open marsh habitats. Interestingly, as a whole, these habitat decisions do appear to coincide with literature about adult habitat use decisions. Next, I investigated pre-flight versus post-flight habitat decisions, and here I found a very different pattern. Here I observed for the pre-flight birds a greater selection for dense marsh habitat over hemi-marsh habitat and a clear avoidance of that open marsh habitat. We're still seeing a selection for that taller vegetation, and we found that they're selecting for persistent emergent vegetation, cattail bulrush, and they're selecting against lotus vegetation, or that floating leaf that's more often associated with open marsh habitats and hemi-marsh habitats. And this pattern of habitat selection may be occurring because these younger juveniles who have poorer movement abilities or no flight ability at this time may require greater predator protection and cover, which is something that these dense habitats can provide and is really a common pattern seen in young birds immediately after they leave the nest. Alternatively, our post-flight fledglings showed a much greater preference for open marsh habitat and a stronger preference for hemi-marsh habitat over dense marsh habitat. We're still seeing that they're selecting for taller emergent vegetation, but here we found that they're selecting for both cattail and bulrush, that persistent emergent, and they're also selecting for lotus vegetation, or that floating leaf that's more often associated with open marsh habitat or hemi-marsh habitat. And we believe that this pattern of habitat selection may be occurring because now that our juveniles have gained flight, they now have a greater predator avoidance skill, and they no longer need to select for habitat that is strictly just for predator avoidance, and they can now select for habitat that is better for hunting efficiency. And studies, not something that we directly measured in our study, but other studies have found that hemi-marsh habitat may be greater for hunting efficiency because it has a greater density of prey available in these hemi-marsh habitats. One anomaly with all of our data, however, was how well water depth performed. So having seen that it was the most significant factor in our first study, again, we're seeing greater predation risk at nests that are either stranded or have less water around them. We would have expected it to be a greater contributing factor for our post-fledging least bitterns habitat selection. But I wouldn't write it off and say that water is ultimately unimportant because there are some underlying factors that may be influencing this relationship. The first being that we're studying nests that have already survived up until this point. So based on the results of our first study, we should be studying nests that are already either over water or close to water. So our juveniles don't need to disperse very far to continue to use these water resources, which will provide them with access to food as well as protection from predators. Another reason that we may be seeing this relationship is that because the dispersal range of our fledglings that we're looking at when we're looking at habitat use versus habitat that they could have used, that is a really small range of space, and we're less likely to see a great difference in water depths when we're looking at a habitat that is largely homogeneous or with a really slow slope into deeper water areas. So next we addressed objective 2, which is looking at fledgling mortality. And this study found that fledgling mortality was contingent upon age and year. And the greatest mortalities were seen in 2020, the year that high intensity early season drawdown, and in young juveniles around 3 days after leaving the nest. So first, this relationship we're seeing with age is very common. We're seeing that post-fledging bottleneck, that spike in mortality right after they leave the nest, which could be due to inexperience being independent or leaving the nest, as well as inexperience dispersing. I will say, though, that despite seeing this post-fledging bottleneck, it was quite different than what we had seen with other studies for other birds, because despite seeing that drop in survival, we are seeing that survival is relatively high for the entire period and sat around 86% for the entire 2 weeks, which is a very high rate of survival. And of the 4 mortalities that we observed in our birds, we only observed 1 predation event, and the other 3 were losses due to starvation or exposure. Another reason that we could be seeing this is because our fledglings are incredibly cryptic and they're really good at hiding. They're incredibly fast. And while we were moving through the marsh, us being potential predators who are not coming from inside of the marsh, we had difficulty moving through it to track down our birds. And when we're thinking of predators that these birds would be concerned with, they would be predators that are coming from outside of the marsh. So we may be seeing greater survival essentially because our fledglings are incredibly specialized to be able to navigate this marsh environment, whereas their predators are not. Next, this relationship that we're seeing with year could be a result of pre and post drawdown conditions. So pre-drawdown conditions determine when habitat is available for a bird to nest, which then influences when young birds are going to fledge and how this timing will align with food availability and predator activity. And post-drawdown conditions influence access to food, given that food is often fish or aquatic invertebrates. Up here, we do have a picture of a least bittern that regurgitated this gar into our hand. This very small bird ate this very large fish, which is incredibly exciting to find. But post-drawdown conditions can also influence predator access to marsh interior. And this could explain why we saw greater survival in 2021 when there is less water removed from our nesting areas as opposed to 2020, the year of the more substantial drawdown. However, to investigate some of the more specific causes of mortality with each year, we would also need to study prey availability, fledgling diet, and fledgling wing development and mass and predator activity, which have been found in other studies to implicate post-fledging mortality. What we can conclude from this study is that post-fledging habitat selection is age and mobility dependent through this critical period, and decisions are being informed by predator protection and hunting efficiency. We also observed low age-specific mortality due to predation and starvation or exposure, suggesting the mobility of these juveniles and the presence of water may be important for post-fledging survival. So as I wrap up here, I do have a lot of people that I need to say thank you for contributing to this project. I need to start, of course, with my master's committee or my co-authors, Dr. Benson, Dr. Fernier, and Dr. Ward. I also need to thank the Forbes Biological Station staff and Josh Osborne, and again, Dr. Fernier, for really helping me to get out in the field in my first and second season and helping me to try and catch some of these very cryptic, sneaky young fledglings around the nest site. Also need to thank Doug Blodgett and Sally McClure of the Nature Conservancy for allowing us to do our research at Emaquan Preserve. Need to thank Kellen Johnson, an undergraduate I had the privilege to work with in my second year. And finally, I need to thank all of my wonderful field technicians I had over the 2 years that worked in this very dense marsh with me, tracking down cryptic birds every single day. It was a great time. It was definitely, a challenge, but I had some great people to work with. So I need to thank Cheyenne Stevens, Nora Hargett, Nicole Petrenti, Cheyenne Beach, Chad Kremer, and Jonathan Stutzman. And finally, I need to thank all of my funding sources that were able to make my thesis research possible. All of them are pictured here. And of course, again, I need to thank Champaign County Audubon Society for providing the funding through their Kendeigh grant, which allowed me to do my research involving these post-fledging least bitterns. I'd like to open it up to any questions that you have for me. I understand that I am submitting this virtually, but of course, feel free to shoot me an email. I would be happy to answer any questions related to my thesis research. Thank you.
There we go. I have questions, but I guess I'll have to email Stephanie with the questions. Are there any comments about the last presentation or any remaining questions for Julie, perhaps? If not, then thank you all for joining today's talks. Julie, it was really wonderful meeting you, and it was also very interesting listening to Stephanie's talk. And I hope you get to come back and chat to us again. And I wish you the best of luck recapturing those meadowlarks.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for having me. I look forward to updating you with how the season goes.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Julie.